The wind howled through the narrow mountain pass, carrying with it shards of ice that bit into exposed skin like daggers. The research team trudged onward, their breaths crystallizing in the frigid air. Snow blanketed the rugged landscape, glowing faintly under the pallid light of a moon veiled by shifting clouds. The world seemed cloaked in silence, save for the crunch of boots and the low groan of the frozen earth beneath their feet. Dr. Meredith Clark led the expedition, her sharp features hardened against the cold. A seasoned glaciologist, she was known for her unyielding resolve. Behind her, Jack, the geophysicist, dragged a sled laden with instruments, his stoic demeanor betraying none of the doubt gnawing at him. To the rear was Elena, the linguist and historian, her wide eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for answers in the desolation. The anomaly had been first reported by satellite, a shimmering light that pulsed and shifted like a living thing, emanating from deep within the glaciers of this remote range. Official channels dismissed it as a natural phenomenon, but Meredith knew better. There was something here, something that defied the ordinary. "We're almost there," Meredith called, her voice barely carrying above the wailing wind. Jack grunted in response, while Elena remained silent, her gaze fixed on a faint, otherworldly glow just over the next ridge. When they crested the rise, the sight stopped them cold. Below, nestled in a jagged basin, was the source of the anomaly, a massive fissure in the glacier, emitting a ghostly blue radiance that painted the snow in eerie hues. It looked like a wound in the ice, raw and ancient, exhaling an invisible energy that made the air itself hum. Jack adjusted his thermal goggles. "Temperature drop is insane," he muttered. "It's like the ice is absorbing heat and something else." Elena shivered, not just from the cold. She pulled her scarf tighter and murmured, "The locals have legends about this pass. They call it the mouth of winter. They say anyone who enters never returns." "Folklore," Meredith dismissed. "We're scientists, not ghost hunters. Whatever's down there, we're going to document it." She glanced back at Elena, her tone softening. "You'll be fine." They descended cautiously, each step taking them deeper into the glow. The fissure yawned wide before them, and as they neared, the air seemed to grow heavy, as though the world itself were holding its breath. When they reached the edge, Meredith shone her flashlight into the depths. The beam was swallowed almost instantly by a shimmering mist, rendering the interior a shifting kaleidoscope of blues and whites. Strange patterns adorned the walls of the crevasse, glyphs carved into the ice, their edges glowing faintly as if alive. Jack knelt, running a gloved hand over the symbols. "These carvings, they don't look natural. Definitely not ice fracturing." "They're warnings," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. She pointed to a sequence of runes. "This symbol, it means threshold. And that one, trap, trap," Meredith echoed. "Or something trapped." A low vibration rippled through the ground beneath them, faint but distinct. The light within the fissure pulsed, brighter now, casting their shadows long and twisted against the snow. Jack stood abruptly. "We should leave. Now." Meredith didn't move. She stared into the depths, her face unreadable. "We came here to uncover the truth. If we leave, we'll never know what's causing this." Elena grabbed her arm. "There are truths we're not meant to know, Meredith. This that feels alive." The fissure's glow intensified, and for a moment, the team was bathed in a light so brilliant it erased all color and shadow. Then, just as suddenly it dimmed, in the silence that followed, Meredith stepped forward, peering into the icy abyss. "It's calling," she said almost to herself. Behind her, Jack and Elena exchanged a glance, the unease between them thick as the cold. Something had shifted, something they couldn't quite name. And as the first flakes of snow began to fall again, their descent into the unknown had truly begun. The fissure loomed before them, its icy walls shimmering with an unnatural luminescence. Meredith stood at its edge, her silhouette sharp against the eerie glow. A fine mist curled upward from the depths, swirling around her boots like tendrils, as if beckoning her closer. Jack shook his head, the weight of unease settling heavier on his shoulders. "This isn't what we signed up for," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "The readings are off the charts, Meredith. This isn't just a geological phenomenon, it's something else." "And that's exactly why we're here," Meredith replied, her gaze never leaving the fissure. "The scientific implications." "Science?" Jack snapped. "Look around. This isn't science, it's madness." Elena stepped between them, her face pale but resolute. "Arguing won't change anything. Meredith's right. We came here to investigate. But Jack's not wrong either. We have no idea what we're walking into." Meredith exhaled sharply and looked at Elena. "What do the inscriptions say? Can they tell us anything about what's down there?" Elena hesitated, her fingers brushing the carvings on the ice. The glyphs seemed to shimmer faintly beneath her touch, as though alive. "They're warnings," she said again, her voice trembling. "But the way they're structured, it's strange. Almost like they're trying to convey more than just danger. Like a plea, or a lure." The ground trembled faintly beneath them, and a low hum resonated from the fissure. It was deeper now, almost melodic, vibrating through their bones. The mist thickened, curling higher, and with it came a sharp chill that burned their lungs. Meredith tightened her grip on the rope slung over her shoulder. "We're not leaving until we've gathered something tangible. Jack, anchor the line." Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening as he fought against the gnawing dread in his chest. But the years of working with Meredith had taught him one thing: arguing was futile. He secured the climbing rope to a nearby outcropping, double-checking the knots before stepping back. "I'll go first," Meredith announced, her tone brooking no argument. Jack grabbed her arm before she could move. "If you go down there and something happens, you're leaving us leaderless." "I'll go." Meredith hesitated, but Jack's expression left no room for debate. She nodded reluctantly and handed him the harness. Jack clipped himself in and began his descent, the rope creaking softly as it bore his weight. The glow intensified the deeper he went, bathing him in shifting hues of blue and white. The walls of the fissure were slick with frost, their carved symbols becoming more intricate and chaotic the further down he climbed. "How's it look, Jack?" Meredith called, her voice strained with tension. Jack paused, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "It's beautiful," he admitted reluctantly. The glow reflected in his goggles, casting his face in an unearthly light. But beneath the beauty, something gnawed at him, a presence, unseen but palpable, pressing against his thoughts. Then he saw it. About 20 feet below, the fissure widened into a cavernous hollow. Jagged spires of ice jutted upward like the teeth of some colossal beast. In the center of the chamber stood a monolith, encased in frost, its surface etched with more glyphs that pulsed faintly in sync with the humming. "Meredith," Jack called, his voice trembling. "There's something down here. A structure." "What kind of structure?" Meredith demanded. Jack shook his head, though he knew they couldn't see him. "I don't know. It's ancient, and there's something." The rope shuddered violently, cutting him off. Jack clung to it, his heart pounding as the vibrations reverberated through his body. From below, a deep, guttural sound echoed, a growl, or perhaps a groan, that seemed to come from the glacier itself. "Jack!" Elena shouted. "What's happening?" "I don't know," he yelled back. "The ice is—" A sudden burst of light erupted from the monolith, blinding him. He cried out, shielding his face as the glow surged upward, spilling out of the fissure and into the night. The ground above trembled, knocking Meredith and Elena to their knees. The humming grew louder, a deafening resonance that filled the air with pressure. Meredith scrambled to the edge of the fissure, yelling Jack's name, but her voice was swallowed by the cacophony. And then, as abruptly as it began, the light and sound ceased. The air was deathly still. "Jack!" Meredith called, her voice shaking. "Jack, do you copy?" No response. Elena crawled to her side, her face stricken. "Pull him up, now!" Meredith didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rope and began hauling it up with Elena's help. Hand over hand, they pulled with desperate strength, the tension in the line growing heavier with every inch. When Jack's body emerged from the fissure, both women recoiled in horror. He was unconscious, his face pale, and his eyes shut tight. But it wasn't just the cold that had claimed him. His hands were raw and blistered, his fingers curled as though clutching something unseen. Strange, intricate symbols were etched into his skin, glowing faintly beneath the frost. And in the silence that followed, a single word escaped his lips, barely audible but filled with dread. Awaken. The team stood frozen, their breath shallow, the drumbeat pounding relentlessly in their skulls. It wasn't a sound, not in the traditional sense. It was a sensation, a pressure that seemed to resonate from within. Jack clutched his head, muttering curses under his breath. Elena backed away from the fissure wall, her wide eyes darting over the warped glyphs. Meredith was the only one who didn't seem fazed. She stared at the place where the obelisk had been, her expression unreadable. "It's still here," she said, her voice calm, almost detached. "What are you talking about?" Jack snapped. "The thing's gone, Meredith. And we need to be too." Elena grabbed Meredith's arm. "Listen to him. We shouldn't have come here. This isn't some natural anomaly. It's something else, something alive." Meredith pulled her arm free. "If it's alive, then we're the first to encounter it. Do you understand what that means? This could rewrite everything we know about." "About what?" Jack interrupted. "Glaciers? Physics? History? Whatever it is, it's playing with us. It's inside our heads." As if to punctuate his words, the drumbeat intensified, making them all flinch. Jack groaned, falling to his knees, while Elena staggered back against the ice wall. Meredith remained standing, her fists clenched, her gaze fixed on the center of the cavern. "It's communicating," she said softly. "Communicating?" Elena said, her voice trembling. "It's trying to tear us apart. No, it's trying to understand us." Meredith turned to them, her eyes alight with something like zeal. "Can't you feel it? It's reaching out." Jack rose unsteadily to his feet, glaring at her. "What I feel is a migraine from hell. And if we stay here, we're going to die, or worse." The glyphs on the walls began to pulse in time with the drumbeat, their glow shifting between cold blue and sickly green. The air grew heavier, pressing down on them like a physical weight. The temperature plummeted further, their breath now freezing into crystalline mist. Elena's flashlight flickered, its beams sputtering before cutting out completely. "No, no, no," she whispered, slapping it against her palm. Jack's light failed next, and soon they were left with only the unnatural glow of the glyphs. "Meredith, we have to go," Elena pleaded. Meredith didn't move, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. "It's showing me something," she said, her voice distant. "Showing you what?" Jack demanded. Meredith didn't answer. Instead, she stepped toward the cavern wall, running her gloved hand over the glyphs. Her eyes widened, her lips moving silently, as if reciting words she didn't understand. Elena grabbed Jack's arm, her voice shaking. "We can't let her touch that thing. It's in her head." Jack nodded grimly, stepping toward Meredith. "Meredith, listen to me. We need you to snap out of it. Whatever this is, it's not safe." Meredith turned to him, her expression serene. "You don't understand. It's showing me everything. The ice holds memories, impressions of something ancient, something vast. If we can connect with it, we could—" A sharp crack echoed through the cavern, silencing her. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently, and a deep fissure split the floor, revealing a chasm that seemed to descend forever. From the depths came a gust of air, icy and fetid, carrying with it a sound, a low, guttural moan that resonated through the walls. The drumbeat stopped, and in the silence that followed, a voice emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the traditional sense. It was a presence, vast and incomprehensible, pressing into their minds like the weight of a glacier. "You are intruders," Meredith gasped, clutching her head. Jack and Elena exchanged panicked glances, their faces pale. "Who are you?" Meredith said aloud, her voice trembling but resolute. The presence didn't respond immediately. When it did, the answer came not in words but in flashes of imagery. A great expanse of ice, untouched for millennia, a world swallowed by frost and silence. Figures trapped in the ice, their forms twisted and contorted, their faces frozen in agony. Elena screamed, falling to her knees. It's not just ancient, it's a graveyard. This place is a graveyard. The cavern walls began to close in, the glyphs twisting and warping as if in agony. The chasm at their feet yawned wider, and from its depths came a sound, a chorus of voices, human and inhuman, wailing in despair. "Meredith, we need to go!" Jack shouted, grabbing her arm. Meredith wrenched free, her eyes wide and unblinking. "We can't leave. Don't you see? If we leave now, we'll never understand." The floor shuddered again, and a massive crack split the wall behind her. From the fissure emerged a shape, a dark, amorphous form that writhed and twisted, its surface shifting like liquid shadow. It had no discernible features, but its presence was suffocating, its form radiating malice. Jack grabbed Elena, pulling her to her feet. "We're leaving. Now!" Meredith turned toward the shape, her face a mix of awe and terror. "It's beautiful," she whispered. The thing moved toward her, the air growing colder with every inch it advanced. The glyphs on the walls dimmed, their light fading as if consumed by the entity's presence. Jack and Elena didn't wait to see what would happen next. They ran, the sound of Meredith's voice echoing behind them. "Wait! Don't leave me!" But then her cries were cut short, swallowed by a silence more terrifying than any sound. Jack and Elena scrambled up the rope, their frozen hands slipping on the icy fibers as they climbed. The fissure walls pulsed faintly with dying light, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. Above them, the night sky was visible, an indifferent expanse of black, speckled with cold, distant stars. The silence below was oppressive, a void where Meredith's voice should have been. Elena kept glancing back down, her breath hitching each time the cavern's blackness seemed to shift. "She's gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It took her." "Keep moving," Jack barked, his voice raw with fear. The drumbeat had returned, but now it was fractured, disjointed. It pounded erratically, a chaotic rhythm that seemed to worm its way into their bones. Each beat felt like a blow, a warning that they were intruding where they didn't belong. As they reached the top of the fissure, Jack pulled himself over the edge and turned to help Elena. Her hand gripped his wrist tightly, her wide eyes meeting his as she whispered, "Do you feel it?" Jack frowned. "Feel what?" "The cold, it's inside us now." Her words hung in the air like frost. Jack didn't respond. He didn't want to. Instead, he hauled her up and onto the snowy plain. The wind had died, and the world felt unnervingly still. Even the snow seemed wrong. It didn't crunch underfoot but muffled their movements like walking on damp wool. Elena clutched her arms, her gaze darting around. "Where's the sound?" "The wind, the ice creaking. There's nothing." Jack shook his head, his face pale. "We'll radio for help as soon as we're back at camp." They trudged through the snow in silence, the fissure's faint glow dimming behind them. The climb had drained what little energy they had left, but they pressed on, driven by fear more than resolve. Yet the further they walked, the stranger the landscape became. The snow, once pristine, was now marred by faint shadows, elongated figures that stretched and danced over the ground despite the absence of any light source. Jack stopped, staring down at the eerie shapes. "What the hell?" Elena clutched his arm. "Don't look at them. Don't acknowledge them." "Why?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But they're watching us." The drumbeat grew louder, no longer just in their heads but vibrating through the air itself. Jack turned sharply as something flickered in the corner of his vision, a dark silhouette standing motionless against the snow. It was humanoid, but impossibly tall, its edges blurred as though it were made of smoke. "Elena," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" She nodded slowly, her face pale. "It's not the only one." More figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. Each one was identical, featureless and wavering, their forms impossibly thin yet towering. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, the air growing colder with every passing second. "What do we do?" Elena whispered, clutching Jack's arm tightly. "We keep moving," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "Don't stop. Don't run. Just walk." They moved together, their steps slow and deliberate. The figures didn't follow, but their gazes, or the absence thereof, seemed to bore into the researchers' backs. The drumbeat quickened, now accompanied by a faint whispering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Jack," Elena said suddenly, her voice sharp with panic. "The camp, it's gone." He stopped, scanning the horizon. The tent and equipment that should have been visible were nowhere to be seen. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a featureless expanse of white and shadow. "That's impossible," Jack muttered. He pulled out his GPS, but the screen was blank, flickering faintly with static. "It's the anomaly," Elena said, her voice tinged with hysteria. "It's warped everything. We're not even in the same place anymore." Jack grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. "We'll figure it out. Just stay with me." The whispering grew louder, the words still incomprehensible, but laced with a malice that sent shivers down their spines. Jack tightened his grip on Elena's hand, pulling her forward. "We keep moving," he repeated, though his own conviction was slipping. As they walked, the shadows on the ground began to shift. They no longer followed the rhythm of the drumbeat, but moved independently, writhing and clawing at the snow. One shadow, larger and darker than the rest, began to rise, detaching itself from the ground. It loomed before them, growing and solidifying into a monstrous form. Its voice was a deep, guttural growl, resonating through the air like an earthquake. "You cannot leave," Elena screamed, and Jack instinctively raised his ice axe. The creature didn't flinch, its eyeless face fixed on them. It extended an elongated arm, pointing back toward the fissure. "Return." Jack's grip on the axe tightened. "What happens if we don't?" The thing tilted its head, the movement unervingly fluid. "Then you will become part of us." The snow beneath their feet shifted, pulling at their boots like quicksand. Jack shouted for Elena to run, but when he turned, she wasn't there. "Elena!" he screamed, his voice swallowed by the whispering void. Jack's voice tore through the suffocating stillness, but it was swallowed almost instantly, leaving only the relentless whispering in its wake. He spun in frantic circles, his eyes darting across the endless expanse of white and shadow. The ground was unbroken snow, no footprints, no sign of her. "Elena!" he bellowed again, his throat raw, his breath fogging in the icy air. The towering figure remained before him, its arms still outstretched toward the fissure. The shadows around it writhed like a nest of serpents, shifting and twisting in unnatural patterns. "She has gone where you will follow." "What did you do to her?" Jack roared, gripping his ice axe so tightly his knuckles burned. The figure tilted its head again, a motion as fluid and inhuman as before. "She is becoming, as you will become." Jack stumbled back, his boots crunching in the snow, his mind racing. He couldn't trust what he was seeing. This thing, whatever it was, it had warped reality itself. He felt the drumbeat in his chest, relentless, chaotic, a countdown he couldn't comprehend. "No," he growled, forcing himself to stand firm. "I'm not playing your game." The creature didn't respond. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form unraveling into tendrils of black mist that seeped into the snow. Jack's chest heaved, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering subsided, leaving only the oppressive silence and the faint drumbeat, now steady and slow. Jack gritted his teeth. "Get it together," he muttered, his voice trembling. He turned toward the horizon, picking a direction at random. The fissure was nowhere in sight, the glow extinguished, as if it had never been. For all he knew, the fissure had swallowed itself back into the glacier, leaving him stranded in this warped, empty expanse. He walked. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface smooth and featureless except for the shifting shadows that danced around him. They never came close, but they were always there, darting just at the edge of his vision. The cold gnawed at him, not just at his flesh but deep inside, sinking into his very bones. He couldn't feel his fingers or toes anymore, and his face burned with frostbite. Still, he pushed forward, the ice axe gripped tightly in one hand. Time lost all meaning. The sky above him was a blank expanse of gray. No sun, no moon, no stars. The drumbeat grew louder, synchronizing with his heartbeat, driving him forward. Then he saw it, a figure in the distance. It was small and hunched, trudging through the snow with slow, deliberate steps. Hope surged in Jack's chest. "Elena," he called, breaking into a stumbling run. The figure didn't respond. As he drew closer, he realized it wasn't Elena. It wasn't human at all. It was Meredith. Meredith. Jack stopped short, his breath catching. She looked wrong. Her body moved stiffly, as though her joints no longer worked properly. Her head hung low, her face obscured by her frost-crusted hood. She was dragging something behind her, something dark and unrecognizable. "Meredith!" Jack shouted again, but she didn't turn. He approached cautiously, the drumbeat now pounding in his ears. "Meredith, what are you doing out here? Where's Elena?" Still, she didn't respond. He reached out to grab her shoulder, and she turned. Her face was hollow, her features sunken and pallid. Her eyes burned with the same cold, malevolent light he'd seen in the obelisk. Her lips twisted into a grotesque semblance of a smile. "You shouldn't have left," she said, her voice layered with something deeper, something that wasn't her. Jack stumbled back, his ice axe raised defensively. "What happened to you? Where's Elena?" Meredith cocked her head, mirroring the creature from earlier. "She's with us now, and soon you will be too." Her shadow moved independently of her body, stretching toward Jack like a living thing. He swung the axe instinctively, the blade slicing through the unnatural darkness. It recoiled, hissing like steam on hot metal. Meredith, or whatever she had become, laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "There's nowhere to go, Jack. You're already part of this." Jack turned and ran, ignoring her calls that twisted and distorted into the wind. The snow beneath his feet seemed to shift, dragging him down, but he pushed forward. He couldn't let himself stop. In the distance, he saw another figure. This one was smaller, moving erratically, as though stumbling. "Elena," he cried, his voice breaking. The figure turned, and this time it was her. Her face was streaked with frost, her eyes wide with terror. "Jack, help me!" He sprinted toward her, ignoring the cold searing his lungs. Behind her, the shadows rose like a tidal wave, writhing and pulsing, their forms indistinct but filled with malice. "Elena, run!" he shouted. She tried, but the snow seemed to hold her in place, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Jack reached her just as the shadows descended, slamming into them like a physical force. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight as the darkness closed in. The last thing he heard was her voice, trembling and desperate. "Jack, I think it's inside me." Jack awoke with a jolt, his body buried halfway in the snow. His head throbbed with a relentless ache, the drumbeat now a dull, constant pressure in the back of his mind. The air was still and heavy, suffused with an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums. "Elena," he croaked, his throat raw. He looked around frantically, his vision blurred. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, but there was no sign of her. Panic surged as he staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunkard. His ice axe was still clutched in his numb hand, its edge dulled and coated with frost. "Elena," he shouted, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then he heard it, a faint sobbing, carried on a non-existent wind. He turned sharply, his pulse quickening. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, an eerie, disembodied wail that twisted his insides. "Elena," he called again, his voice trembling. The sobbing grew louder, more distinct, and he realized it wasn't just crying. It was fragmented words, whispered through tears. "Jack, please help me." He staggered forward, following the sound. The snow seemed to shift beneath his boots, dragging at him like quicksand. The landscape itself warped as he moved, distant shapes rising and falling like waves on an ocean of white. The sobbing led him to a jagged outcropping of ice, its surface etched with faint glyphs that pulsed weakly, as if they were dying. At the base of the outcrop, he found her. Elena was huddled against the ice, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her face was buried, her body shivering violently. And Jack dropped to his knees beside her, gripping her shoulders. "I'm here. I've got you." She didn't lift her head, her sobbing continuing unabated. "It's inside me," she whispered. "I can feel it crawling, whispering. It's changing me." "No," Jack said firmly, shaking her gently. "You're fine. You're gonna be fine. We'll get out of here together." She looked up then, and Jack felt his stomach drop. Her eyes weren't her own anymore. The once warm, brown irises had turned a dull, milky white, shot through with cracks like fractured glass. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her veins glowed faintly beneath the surface, pulsing in time with the drumbeat. "I don't think I can leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm part of it now." "You're not," Jack snapped, his voice breaking. "You're still you. Fight it, Elena. Whatever it's doing to you, fight it." She shook her head slowly, tears freezing against her cheeks. "I don't think there's a me left to fight. It's too much. It's everything. The glacier, the obelisk, the thing. They're all connected, Jack. They're all part of the same thing." Jack's grip tightened on her shoulders. "What are you talking about? What thing?" She looked past him, her gaze distant. "The ice remembers," she murmured. "It's not just frozen water, it's a prison. A prison for something old, something vast. And it's waking up." The ground beneath them shuddered, a deep, resonant vibration that made the ice outcropping groan like a living creature. The glyphs on its surface flared to life, their faint glow brightening into a searing light. "Elena, we need to move," Jack shouted, pulling her to her feet. But she resisted, her feet rooted to the ground. "I can't," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm not meant to leave." "Elena, listen to me," Jack shouted, his desperation mounting. "If you stay here, you'll die. Or worse. I'm not leaving without you." Her gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of her old self breaking through. "Jack," she said quietly, "you don't understand. I'm already gone." Before he could respond, the ice behind her erupted. A jagged crack split the outcrop, and from within came a flood of black mist, writhing and twisting as it poured into the open air. The mist coalesced into shapes, vague, humanoid figures with glowing eyes and grasping limbs. They surrounded Elena, their movements unnervingly fluid, their whispers growing louder. Jack lunged forward, swinging his axe wildly. "Get away from her," he roared. The figures didn't react. Instead, they reached for Elena, their hands sinking into her body like smoke. She gasped, her back arching as the light beneath her skin flared brighter, her veins glowing like molten cracks in stone. "Jack," she said, her voice strangled. "It's too late." Jack shouted, his voice raw. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her free, but the shadows held her fast. The light in her eyes grew brighter, blinding, until, with a deafening crack, the outcrop shattered, and Elena was gone. Jack was thrown back, the force of the explosion knocking him into the snow. When he opened his eyes, the outcrop was nothing but a smoking crater, its glyphs extinguished. The figures were gone, and the whispering had ceased. "Elena," he whispered, his voice breaking. But there was no answer, only the drumbeat, louder now than ever before. And beneath it, a voice, deep, resonant, and inescapable. "You are next." Jack lay sprawled in the snow, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The weight of the unseen presence bore down on him, suffocating, as if the air itself were made of stone. His fingers curled around the haft of his ice axe, now dull and chipped, his only weapon against whatever forces had claimed Elena. The drumbeat in his mind grew louder, echoing like a war chant. He staggered to his feet, his legs trembling. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The endless white void stretched in every direction, a cold, silent purgatory. "You're not taking me," Jack growled through gritted teeth. His voice sounded small and hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence. A new sound broke the stillness, a low, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the snow itself. It was the same sound he'd heard when they first encountered the obelisk, but now it carried a mocking tone, like laughter from a god watching ants squirm. From the mist ahead, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it drew closer, its form became clearer. It was one of the figures he'd seen before, tall, impossibly thin, and wavering like smoke in the wind. But this one was different. Its eyes weren't the cold, alien lights he remembered. They were human. They were Elena's. Jack froze, his breath catching. "Elena!" The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment her voice came, faint and distorted. "Jack, help me!" He stepped forward instinctively, but the figure recoiled, its form twisting unnaturally. The human eyes flickered, replaced by the glowing, malevolent orbs of the others. "She is part of us now," the figure intoned, its voice a guttural blend of countless others. "Give her back!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking. He raised the axe, his hands trembling. The figure laughed, a sound that scraped against his nerves like nails on glass. "You are not here to save. You are here to become." The snow beneath Jack's feet shifted, pulling at him like a living thing. He stumbled, falling to one knee as the cold seeped into his bones. The ground around him darkened, the pristine white replaced by a swirling, inky blackness that spread outward in tendrils. "No," he muttered, clawing at the snow to pull himself free. "I'm not part of this. I won't be." The shadowy tendrils wrapped around his legs, dragging him down. The void beneath him yawned wide, an abyss that seemed to stretch into eternity. Jack clawed at the surface, his gloves tearing as his fingers dug into the frozen ground. As he was pulled deeper, his surroundings began to change. The snow and ice gave way to a vast obsidian cavern, its walls glistening like wet glass. The drumbeat echoed louder now, amplified by the cavern's vast emptiness. Shadows moved along the walls, not cast by any light but alive, watching him. At the center of the cavern was the obelisk, whole once more, its surface writhed with inscriptions, the symbols shifting and rearranging like a living language. The hum grew deafening, resonating through Jack's skull, threatening to split it open. He was forced to his knees before the obelisk, his body shaking as he tried to resist. The black tendrils wrapped around his arms and chest, holding him in place. "You won't win," he hissed, his vision blurring. The voice came again, deep and resonant, filling the cavern with its presence. "You were never meant to win. You are meant to endure." The obelisk flared with light, and Jack screamed as images flooded his mind. He saw the glacier as it was millennia ago, vast and untouched, a prison crafted by hands long since turned to dust. He saw the thing entombed within it, a being of shadow and ice, vast beyond comprehension. It had no form, yet it was all forms. It was the glacier, the obelisk, the shadows, the drumbeat. It was everything, and it was awake. Jack's screams echoed through the cavern, mingling with the whispers of the shadows. His mind fractured under the weight of the images, splintering into fragments. He saw Meredith, her face hollow and empty, her body a vessel for the thing's will. He saw Elena, her form dissolving in a shadow, her eyes pleading with him one last time before they were gone. And then he saw himself. He saw his body consumed by the darkness, his mind hollowed out and filled with the endless hum of the obelisk. He saw himself becoming one of the shadows, a figure to haunt the endless void, whispering to the next intruder who dared step into the glacier's domain. "No," he growled, his voice raw. "I won't let you." He summoned every ounce of strength he had left and drove the ice axe into the ground. The tendrils recoiled, and for a moment, the light of the obelisk dimmed. Jack pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. The obelisk flared again, and the voice spoke with finality. "You cannot escape." But Jack didn't look back. He ran, his legs heavy, his breath ragged. The cavern shifted and twisted around him, the shadows clawing at his heels. The drumbeat rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning out his thoughts. Ahead, he saw a faint light, a break in the darkness. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, he sprinted toward it, his body screaming in protest. The light grew brighter until he was back on the glacier, the fissure gaping behind him like a maw. The cold wind bit at his face, and the snow crunched beneath his boots. The drumbeat was gone, replaced by the low howl of the storm. But the whispering remained, faint and mocking. And as he looked back at the fissure, he saw the shadows watching him, their glowing eyes promising one thing. This wasn't over. Jack stumbled through the snow, his breath rasping in his throat as the storm closed in. The fissure loomed behind him, its glow extinguished, but he could still feel it. The pull of the anomaly gnawed at the edge of his mind, a siren call that threatened to drag him back. The whispering was faint now, no longer a cacophony, but a constant murmur, like the hiss of wind through the mountains. He clenched his fists, trying to block it out, but it seeped into his thoughts, coiling around his memories like a parasite. Elena, he whispered, the name like a prayer. The landscape had changed. The pristine snow was no longer untouched. It was littered with jagged shards of ice that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The wind carried faint sounds, cries, perhaps, or laughter. Jack couldn't tell anymore. He pressed on, his body weak, his mind fraying. The cold was unbearable, a living thing that gnawed at his flesh. He looked down and saw his hands, purple and swollen, frostbite claiming them. Yet he barely felt the pain. A numbness had taken hold, spreading through his body like a creeping shadow. As he climbed a ridge, his foot caught on something. He fell hard, the ice axe slipping from his grip and skittering across the ground. Swearing, he turned to see what had tripped him. It was a skeleton. The remains were ancient, the bones yellowed and brittle. Fragments of clothing clung to the corpse, frozen stiff, and a rusted climbing harness encircled its ribs. Jack stared at the hollow sockets of its skull, feeling an inexplicable pull toward it. Then he saw the glyphs. They were carved into the ice surrounding the body, faint but unmistakable. The same symbols that adorned the obelisk, the walls of the cavern, and the fissure itself. He traced them with his eyes, and as he did, a vision flickered in his mind. A figure descending into darkness, swallowed by shadow, their screams fading into the drumbeat. Jack scrambled away, his pulse pounding. He turned to grab his axe, but it was gone. The wind howled louder, carrying with it the faint echo of footsteps. "You are marked," a voice whispered, barely audible over the storm. He spun around, but there was no one there. Only the skeletal remains, their hollow sockets seeming to mock him. He stumbled to his feet, forcing himself forward, the weight of the voice pressing down on him like the glacier itself. Ahead, a faint light pierced the storm. It flickered and wavered, but it was real, something tangible in the chaos. He broke into a shambling run, his boots slipping on the icy ground. The light grew brighter, and soon he saw its source, a small cabin, half buried in snow. Smoke curled from its chimney, and the faint glow of a fire shone through the frosted windows. Relief surged through him, and he slammed into the door, pounding on it with his fists. "Help, please," he shouted, his voice raw. The door creaked open, and an old man peered out, his face lined and weathered. His eyes narrowed as they took in Jack's haggard appearance. Without a word, he stepped aside, motioning for Jack to enter. Jack collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking violently as the warmth enveloped him. The old man shut the door and returned to the fire, stirring a pot of something that smelled faintly of herbs and meat. "You've been to the fissure," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. "How do you know?" The man didn't look at him, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Because you wouldn't be here if you hadn't. The mountain only lets you find this place if you've seen it." Jack sat up, his head swimming. "You know what's down there? What it is?" The old man nodded slowly. "I know enough. The ice remembers, boy. It holds things that should never have been woken. What is it? Jack demanded. What's down there? The man sighed, finally meeting Jack's eyes. It doesn't have a name, not one you'd understand. It's older than the glacier, older than the mountains. It was trapped there long before we walked this earth. Jack's fist clenched. It's not trapped anymore. It's spreading. It took my friends. The man's expression darkened. Then it's already begun. What's begun? Jack demanded. What's happening to me? The old man hesitated, his gaze flicking to Jack's hands. You're marked, he said softly. It's in you now. You've seen it, felt it. It never lets go. Jack's breath hitched. What does that mean? Can I get rid of it? The man shook his head. You can't fight it. You can only endure it or give in. Jack stood, his hands trembling. There has to be a way. There has to be some way to stop it. The man looked at him with pity. The glacier isn't just a prison. It's a seal, and seals can be broken. Jack's heart sank. So, what do I do? The old man turned back to the fire, his voice barely above a whisper. Pray. Jack sat by the fire, his eyes staring blankly at the dancing flames. The old man's words echoed in his mind, heavy and final. You're marked. He flexed his frostbitten fingers, watching as faint shadows coiled beneath his skin, a reminder of what had begun to take root inside him. The old man shuffled around the cabin, muttering to himself as he pulled items from shelves. Jars filled with strange herbs, tools rusted with age, and a heavy leather-bound book adorned with glyphs similar to those on the glacier. You said the glacier's a seal, Jack said finally, his voice hoarse. If it's breaking, can it be repaired? The man paused, his back to Jack. For a long moment, he said nothing, then turned slowly, his weathered face drawn with fatigue. You don't repair something like this. You survive it. Jack shot to his feet, anger flaring. I didn't come all this way to survive. It's spreading. Whatever's down there, it's not staying put. It'll reach beyond the glacier, beyond the mountains. What happens when it finds someone else? Another town? A city? The old man held Jack's gaze, his eyes shadowed with the weight of untold years. You think I don't know? I've seen what it can do. But you can't fight the glacier. You can't fight the thing in it. It's older than the stars, older than the concept of defiance. Jack's breath caught. So what? We just let it consume everything. The man sighed and sat heavily in a creaking wooden chair. He opened the leather-bound book and flipped through its fragile pages. Glyphs and diagrams covered the parchment, drawn in a spidery hand. Finally, he stopped on a page depicting a massive black obelisk encased in ice. Every few centuries, someone stumbles on it, the man said quietly. The glacier calls to them, pulls them in. Most don't survive. But those who do, they're left with a piece of it. It marks them like it's marked you. And through them, it spreads. Jack leaned closer, his pulse quickening. How do you stop it? The man tapped the drawing of the obelisk with a gnarled finger. The seal's failing, but the source is still there. If someone strong enough were to face it, truly face it, they might hold it back. They might give us a few more years, maybe a few centuries. Then I'll do it, Jack said, his voice firm. Tell me what I need to do. The old man's eyes narrowed. You don't understand what you're saying. The glacier doesn't just kill you. It consumes you. It makes you part of itself. That drumbeat you hear? That whispering? It's the glacier speaking through you. It wants you to come back. I don't care, Jack said, his hands clenching into fists. It took Elena. It took Meredith. It's not taking anyone else. The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If you go back, there's no guarantee you'll return. But if you're determined, there's a ritual. A way to confront the thing directly. Jack stepped forward. What do I need to do? The old man turned the book toward him, revealing an intricate diagram encircled by glyphs. These symbols are a map. They'll lead you to the heart of the glacier, where the seal is weakest. But you'll need to carve the glyphs into the ice as you go. It's the only way to guide your path and keep the shadows at bay. Jack swallowed hard. And then, the man's expression grew grim. And then you'll stand before it. The source of the glacier, the thing the ice was built to contain. If you're strong enough, you might push it back. But if you fail, Jack nodded, understanding. If I fail, I'm part of it. The old man didn't respond. He simply handed Jack a small satchel filled with tools, chisels, flints, and a vial of something dark and viscous. Use this to carve the glyphs. The glacier won't like it. It'll fight you, but it's your only chance. Jack took the satchel, his jaw set. How do I find my way back to the fissure? The old man gestured toward the door. You won't need to. It's already calling you. Just listen. Jack hesitated, the weight of the task pressing down on him. Then he turned and stepped into the storm. The wind tore at his clothes, howling like a living thing as he trudged through the snow. The drumbeat in his mind was steady now, guiding him forward like a beacon. The whispers grew louder with each step, their words teasing the edge of understanding. Ahead, the ground began to glow faintly, the light of the fissure bleeding into the storm. Jack felt the pull intensify, a magnetic force that made his legs move even as his instincts screamed for him to turn back. When he reached the edge, the fissure was wider than before, its glow a pulsating heartbeat of blue and green. The glyphs on its walls writhed like living things, twisting and reshaping themselves as if alive. Jack took a deep breath and descended. The ice was cold beneath his hands, burning like fire, but he didn't stop. With each step, the whispers grew louder, the drumbeat faster. The glacier was alive, and it knew he was coming, and it was waiting. The fissure swallowed Jack whole, its icy walls twisting and glowing with unnatural light. The drumbeat in his head grew deafening, each pulse sending a jolt of pain through his skull. The whispers that had teased the edges of his mind were now a torrent, a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others mocking, all pulling him deeper into the glacier's grasp. With trembling hands, Jack reached into the satchel and pulled out the first chisel and vial. The liquid inside the vial shimmered darkly, pulsing like a living thing. He dipped the chisel into it, watching as the substance clung to the blade, and began to carve the first glyph into the wall. As the chisel bit into the ice, the glacier screamed. The sound was otherworldly, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from the ice itself. Shadows rippled along the walls, recoiling from the glowing glyph as it burned into the surface. The drumbeat faltered, the rhythm stuttering like a heart skipping a beat. Jack pressed on, carving another glyph, and then another. The path before him twisted and warped, the glacier reshaping itself to confuse and trap him. But the glowing symbols guided his way. Each cut into the ice felt like a blow against a living creature, the glacier groaning and trembling beneath his feet. At last, he reached the cavern. The heart of the glacier was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. The obelisk stood in the center, its surface writhing with glyphs that twisted and flickered like flames. The air here was alive, pressing against Jack like a tangible force, heavy with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. He approached slowly, the chisel in his hand trembling. The obelisk pulsed with light, and the shadows around it seemed to reach for him, their tendrils writhing like snakes. "You have come," a voice boomed, deep and resonant, shaking the cavern. "You are marked. You are mine." Jack's knees buckled, but he forced himself to stand. "I'm not yours," he shouted, his voice echoing weakly against the massive walls. "I came to stop you." The obelisk laughed, the sound reverberating through the ice. "You cannot stop what is eternal. You are but a moment of flicker. I'm the glacier. I am the cold. I am the memory of the world." Jack clutched the satchel tighter. "You're just a parasite. You've been locked away because you're too weak to survive without feeding on others." The shadows surged toward him, but Jack swung the chisel, the glowing glyphs on the walls flaring to life. The shadows recoiled, hissing and shrieking. The obelisk pulsed angrily, its light flickering. "You think you can defy me? You are already part of me." Jack felt a searing pain in his chest, and he dropped to his knees. He looked down and saw the veins in his arms glowing faintly, the shadowy tendrils beneath his skin writhing like worms. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to his feet. "I'm not yours," he growled. "Not yet." He reached into the satchel and pulled out the last vial. The The liquid inside was darker than the others, almost black, and it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. He dipped the chisel into it, the substance clinging to the blade like tar, and turned to the obelisk. The obelisk flared, the glyphs on its surface twisting into sharp, jagged shapes. The voice roared, the cavern trembling. "Stop! You do not know what you awaken." Jack swung the chisel, driving it into the base of the obelisk. The impact sent a shock wave through the cavern, and the glyphs on the obelisk flared brightly before flickering and dying. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into mist. The drumbeat faltered, then stopped. The whispers fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of Jack's ragged breathing. He stared at the obelisk, its surface dark and lifeless. The weight in the air had lifted, and the glacier felt still, almost peaceful. But then the ice beneath his feet began to crack. The obelisk shuddered, fractures spreading across its surface. A deep, resonant hum filled the cavern, growing louder with each passing second. Jack stumbled back as the obelisk exploded, shards of black ice flying in every direction. From the center of the explosion emerged a shape, formless and vast, a writhing mass of shadow and light. It pulsed with a cold, alien energy, its presence overwhelming. Jack fell to his knees, his vision blurring. "You have freed me," the voice said, now deafening and omnipresent. "The seal is broken. The glacier will fall. And with it, the world." Jack tried to rise, but the weight of the thing bore down on him. He felt the shadows creeping toward him, seeping into his mind, his body. He closed his eyes, his thoughts filled with Elena, Meredith, and the faces of those he'd lost. "I won't let you," he whispered. With the last of his strength, he raised the chisel and drove it into his own chest, carving the final glyph into his skin. The symbol flared, and the cavern erupted in light. The last thing Jack saw was the creature recoiling, its form writhing in agony. And then there was only silence. When the storm cleared, the fissure was gone. The glacier was still, its surface smooth and unbroken. But deep beneath the ice, the shadows waited, and the drumbeat began.